Welcome everyone, and welcome to Slow Art Friday. I'm Paige Taylor, the Learning and Engagement Assistant here at the Asheville Art Museum, and I'm joined today by Ralinda Lurie, our touring docent. As you participate today, please remember to choose a quiet space and silent alerts from devices. Try not to sit in front of a bright light source. Use headphones and microphone for the best listening experience. Use a desktop laptop for the best viewing experience. And please make sure that your screen name includes your first name and last name, or first name and last initial. To ask questions or make comments, you can unmute your microphone, type into the chat box, or raise your hand. And just a reminder, we are recording, so if you prefer not to be part of the recording, you're welcome to turn off your video and mute your mic, and you can participate through the chat box. Each Friday at 12 p.m., docents lead virtual interactive conversations about a few artworks in our collection or special exhibitions. The goal is simple: slow down, discover the joy of looking at art, and talk about the experience with others. For today's program, Ralinda will lead us in an interactive conversation about a few artworks in our collections and special exhibit. We'll spend about 15 minutes or so with each artwork. Ralinda will allow us time to look at each artwork on our own slowly before leading a conversation about each one with questions. As participants, we encourage you to engage in dialogue with Ralinda, myself, and each other. And Ralinda, what are we going to be talking about today?
Well, first, let me just say, as Paige did, welcome everybody to Slow Art Friday. I'm a touring docent with the museum, and for the next hour, we're going to be exploring together the art of portraits. So what is a portrait? Well, the word portrait comes from the Latin portrahere, if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but which translates as to drag out, reveal, expose. Yikes. Yet people have been pretty obsessed with seeing themselves represented in all manner of artistic media: ink, paint, stone, film, pixels. Seems we've always been pretty self-absorbed. By definition, according to the Tate in Britain, a portrait is a representation of a particular person. Merriam-Webster expands the definition to include a sculptured figure. And the Oxford English Dictionary goes even further to include something which represents, typifies, or resembles the object described or implied, a type, a likeness. Portraits have been around for a very long time. The oldest known representation of a human face was discovered in a grotto in Western France and dated from around 27,000 years ago. Although as an art form, portraits can be traced back to ancient Egypt, when faces were painted on the lids of mummy cases to memorialize the deceased. From ancient times to the Middle Ages, as both public and private art, portraits have celebrated powerful political figures, honored them in death, conveyed religious teachings, burnished the image of emperors, kings, and popes, and advertised the financial resources and prominence of the wealthy. By the 18th and 19th centuries, portraiture had grown as a genre, along with the increase in commerce and wealth outside of the aristocracy, and the wish to create a permanent visual record of individuals as well as their families. Then along came photography in 1839, and with this new medium, capturing a realistic image of people and events became cheaper and more available. So portraiture became even more popular and widespread. Regardless of the medium, however, throughout history, portrait art has reflected the artistic sensibilities of the time. So the three works of art that I have chosen for our conversation today are all portraits. At least they qualify according to at least one of the definitions I mentioned. What we're about to think and talk about is what makes a portrait art. Are these portraits individualized representations or representational of a type? What can we discover about the subject from the artistic rendering of their image? Does each seem to be a good likeness, or the artist's interpretation of the subject? How much do these portraits reveal about the personality of the subject? What do they divulge about the artist? Do portraits elicit different connections with the viewer than other images? Let's see what we can find. Paige, may we please see the first artwork? So let's begin by taking about 10 seconds to quietly look at this first artwork. Taking 10 seconds goes by very quickly, doesn't it? And let's begin with the question of what's going on in this artwork?
To me, it looks like, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Liz.
I was just about to say, she looks as if she's in the midst of, laughing or talking, with her mouth is open. So it seems like it's really kind of caught this moment in time.
Okay, so you see the photographer has captured this subject in a happy moment. What else can we find?
Well, I happen to know who it is a picture of, so, and she had an amazing life, but I won't say. But I definitely think the shadowing and the lighting and the coloring, as well as the fact that it's face on and you just see her mouth and eyes, I think really makes the picture.
Okay, so the full kind of frontal image really has an impact on how you see this portrait, and also the photographer's use of or been able to capture the shadow and the light in this particular image.
Yes.
I think it seems very candid to me. It's not posed. And she was just caught in a very open moment.
So the photographer then in that situation, Ellen, where you're saying that it was a candid moment,
yes.
Where was the photographer when this was taken? Where was she and what was happening in the relationship between the photographer and the subject in this moment? Any thoughts?
I would think that she was maybe using a zoom lens or some kind of a long focal lens, and was maybe not particularly close to her, because usually a person doesn't know when a candid is being taken of her.
Okay. So you're seeing this as the photographer having done this from a distance, catching the subject unawares.
Yes.
And okay. And thinking then about the photographer and their location, do you have any thoughts? Anyone have thoughts on who else or what else might be happening around the subject that would have prompted this particular expression?
She was in a group talking.
Yeah, she seems interactive with someone.
Yeah.
She just seems to me, and I'm an unsophisticated art person, this is just new to me, this seminar in itself. I just basically see a very happy person.
Mm-hmm. Happiness, and so then when seeing happiness, what else can you see about, perhaps tells you more about the personality of this subject? We have a happy face. Anything else here that's a clue to the character of this particular individual?
Well, she looks like she's outside.
Okay.
You can kind of see the background of the building behind her.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's a brick, or it looks brick or maybe shingled. And it looks like it's natural sunlight. So she's outside enjoying the day, like I'm enjoying the day.
I think that, well, and as a little sidebar here, thank you all for enjoying, an hour inside with all of us. I really appreciate that. So, so the outdoor scene really affects her enjoyment of the moment. Anything else that you can see about, perhaps revealing about the personality of this individual?
Well, before that, I think the cropping is very interesting, because we can only imagine what else is in the photo or where she actually is, or if there's another person there. and what she's actually doing or seeing, because we've got such a close up there with the cropping. But also, I think probably a number of photos were taken and this one was selected, and it was just like click, 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 following her as she moved around, and then this was the perfect one.
So perhaps the photographer didn't capture just one, although you can take many in sequence, but did not particularly target this moment because of course it would be fleeting, but took a series of photos and then selected the one that she felt was the most representative of the individual. Do you think the artist and the subject know each other?
Cool.
Doesn't appear to. No.
And what do you see in the picture, Emma, that makes you say that?
It just seems so candid to me, that it's not a forced smile. It's just natural.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts on the artist and the subject relationship?
I disagree. Just it seems to me that she's more interactive. So I feel like she's knows the person well enough to be genuine in front of them, to be able to laugh and be joyous in front of somebody like that. It shows a level of vulnerability, I think, in the subject.
Okay, so that expression in and of itself shows a comfort level with the photographer, and whether the photographer was in close proximity or at a distance, as has been also hypothesized, the subject would have been okay to have been seen with, you know, she obviously has, you know, in terms of her appearance, she's not posed or dressed up for this. She's happy to be captured in her element, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
What if this photograph had been?
Something?
Yes, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I think that because it is a candid, and that she may be in a group, and because that she may not even realize, well, she doesn't realize that the photographer is taking the picture, and she may be reacting because of the group, and it's a question whether she does know the photographer or not, and just because she is so happy, I think that's the true candidness of it. But she may be also laughing at what's going on around her.
Yes, that's
not having anything to do with the
true.
photographer.
Yeah, that's very true.
That's kind of an interesting observation, because it makes you speculate on perhaps is she standing with a lot of other people, and when this picture was taken, everybody's laughing at something, and the photographer has just, to someone else's point, cropped her in such a way that all you see is this particular individual and not the rest of the group. So that's something one could imagine happening as well. What else can we find in the picture? Anybody have a comment on the use of black and white versus how this photograph would have been different if it had been in color?
I think it gives it a timelessness. I don't know that I feel like I can put my finger on when this photo was taken. It feels like it could have been any time in, you know, the past 50 plus years. You know, it's almost, to me, maybe this is just my screen, I don't know, it reads almost more sepia than like a very harsh black and white too. And I think that for me, you know, I think of sepia tone things as being, you know, kind of timeless. So.
Okay, so it's very hard to date the photograph because of the use of sepia black and white photography as opposed to color photography. Would color photography have helped to narrow down potentially the time frame when the photo was taken?
I think so. And I also think the use of black and white, for some reason, I don't see only joy in this picture.
Okay.
I mean, obviously she looks joyous, but I feel like there's another emotion that maybe has some darkness in it as well. I don't know if any, maybe I'm crazy, but.
No, I think we'll let's keep that kind of in our minds when I'm going to follow our conversation here shortly with a information about this particular artist, and also because of the notability of the subject, to tell you a little about her as well. And I think that your point will resonate when we get to that conversation. One last, kind of question here. Are any of your other senses, other than your visual sense, triggered by this image?
I feel happy and sad, and I don't know why. I still see some sadness there.
Okay. Does anyone else feel, I know for me personally, I feel sun warmth from the way that the light hits her hair and her face, and it just sort of seems to be a warm sensation because of the lighting in this particular picture. Anyone else have any other kind of sensory response?
I agree with you, Ralinda. And I guess there's like a little teeny tiny area where you notice that she has what looks like a turtleneck sweater on, but it looks like it's also a short sleeve turtleneck. So I'm guessing that it is warmer outside, and she's out in the sunshine, and it's a warm day versus, a winter day.
Mm-hmm.
But
it looks like she may have been moving, because look at her hair, or her head at least was moving, because her hair on the left side is blurred, as if she had been shaking her head.
Okay, so maybe there was some movement on the part of the subject as well, and the photographer was able to capture it, and in a moment which still made a very crisp image despite that. Any other thoughts before we move on to some information about the artist and the subject? No? Okay, let me tell you a little bit about this artwork. This is a gelatin silver print titled Portrait of Ruth Asawa, as you can see on the screen, and it was taken by Hazel Larson Archer in 1947. The process to produce this image, the gelatin silver process, was the most common method of making black and white prints, especially for art photographers who wanted high quality. From the 1890s until around the 1970s, some people still do it, but it's not as common nowadays. Basically, the process involves transferring a negative image to 4-layer light-sensitive paper, where the image consists of silver metal particles suspended in a gelatin layer. And don't ask me what that all means, because it makes my brain hurt to think about it. So, but that's what it is. So Hazel Larson Archer was an American photographer born in 1921 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. At the age of 10, she contracted polio. As a result of her need to use braces, crutches, and eventually a wheelchair, she developed keen powers of observation. As she noted, quote, "I was always more interested in watching what was going on. When I began photographing, I was the observer," end quote. After graduating from the University of Wisconsin in 1944, Archer attended summer school at Black Mountain College in Black Mountain, North Carolina, which is about 16 miles west of Asheville. Black Mountain College was an experimental undergraduate college founded in 1933, which promoted the study and practice of art as an indispensable aspect of a student's general liberal arts education. With the rise of Hitler at the time, remember early 30s here, the Bauhaus School in Germany was closed, and artists and intellectuals in Europe increasingly were persecuted. Some left Europe and found their way to Black Mountain College as students and faculty. The college was an institution owned and operated by the faculty, where all members of the community participated in its operation. Although the college closed in 1937 or 57, so you can't actually go and see it today, due to financial difficulties, it attracted and nurtured many influential 20th century artists in a number of disciplines, including, you may recognize a number of these names: Joseph and Annie Albers, Wilhelm and Elaine de Kooning, Robert Rauschenberg, Merce Cunningham, and Buckminster Fuller. Geodesic dome and all of that. So at Black Mountain College, Archer studied art, design, and photography from 1944 to 1948, and was invited in 1949 to serve as the first full-time member of the faculty teaching photography. For the next 5 years, her focus was on teaching students how to see rather than techniques for picture taking. Later, she would call this perception. In her words, perception is hard to describe, but it's wonderful to learn to watch without judgment and opinion. That which was not recognized previously begins to surface as some kind of surprise, and one begins to become aware of what one was not aware of previously. Her photographs at Black Mountain captured college life, including her fellow students, members of the faculty, the college campus, and the surrounding countryside. Although perhaps her most famous series of photos were of faculty member Merce Cunningham, who was an influential choreographer who challenged the traditional ideas of dance. Interestingly, Archer always framed or cropped her photos in the camera, not in the darkroom. And her images often contrasted light and shadow in tones of black and white, as we see in this portrait of Ruth Asawa. As one of her teachers, Buckminster Fuller, said of her, she saw what we who hurry never have the time to see. She saw life processes. She saw the tree breathing, and she let us see with her what we had never been privileged to see before. After Archer left the college in 1953, along with her husband, who had been a student there, and opened a photography school in the town of Black Mountain, where she mostly shot family portraits. In 1957, they moved to Tucson, Arizona, where she opened another photography studio, became the director of adult education at the Tucson Art Center, which would become the Tucson Museum of Art, and founded 2 private schools as well. After 18 years in Tucson, Archer moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where she died in 2001. This portrait of Ruth Asawa from 1947 was taken when Archer and Asawa were both students at Black Mountain College. With a total student population of 1,200 over the 24 years of the institution's existence, it seems likely that Archer and Asawa knew each other. I don't know definitively, but it seems likely that they did. What I find remarkable is the infectious joy in Asawa's face that Archer captures in this photograph, especially when you know a little about Ruth Asawa's background. And here's to Sally's point about there being some sadness in it as well. She was born in California to immigrant Japanese parents who were not allowed to become US citizens or to own land due to the discriminatory laws at the time. In 1942, her father was arrested and sent to a Justice Department camp in New Mexico, while Ruth and her mother and siblings were interned in horse stables at the Santa Anita racetrack before being moved to the Romer Relocation Center in Arkansas, so internment camp. After graduating from high school, Asawa studied to be an art teacher at the Milwaukee State Teachers College, but was unable to complete her student teaching due to hostility against the Japanese. So she headed to Black Mountain College to study art. There she was welcome and found encouragement and inspiration. It was truly a transformative experience for her. For the first time, she was accepted as a unique and valued individual and gained the courage to become an artist. In fact, Ruth Asawa became quite a celebrated and prolific artist. She's perhaps best known for her looped wire sculptures, which were actually featured on a US Postal Service stamp last year. And during her life, she was also an active member of the arts community in San Francisco, serving on the San Francisco Arts Commission and as a trustee of the Young Museum. I know I'm going on too long, but one last thing. For me, this photograph of a young woman who had experienced so much discrimination and so many obstacles in her young life, totally relishing this time with such unfettered glee, reveals a lot about her character and as well Helen Archer's ability to recognize and record this telling yet fleeting moment. So, all right, we will rush on now. We'll go, please, Paige, to our next artwork, which we'll again spend just a short time quietly looking at together. Okay, I think everyone knows what the first question is going to be. And the first question is, what's going on in this artwork?
As a portrait, it's almost accentuated or caricature type, the way the huge lips and the elongated face, along with all of the colors, as opposed to a actual photo of someone. So I find the shapes and colors very interesting.
Okay, so the shapes and the colors have transform this from perhaps a realistic representation of an individual to you're characterizing it more as a caricature of the individual. Okay. What more can we find?
It looks like, I can't really tell what the medium is, but it looks like there's parts that are raised, like the kind of the outlines of the face and the hair, and some of the designs in the background. It really looks like this, it's very heavily textured to me. So yeah, I don't know what the materials are, or necessarily, you know, why the artist made that particular choice, but perhaps they wanted to, you know, accentuate the outlines or certain elements by raising those above the rest of the piece.
Okay, so yes, please.
I'm sorry. It reminds me somewhat of the style of Picasso's African mask period, which was what, in the 19-teens, 1920s. That it's almost mask-like, and of course with the exaggerated features. And there was something about it, even with the use of the color, it's almost cubistic, but not quite. That's why I said think of it in terms of Picasso and the like Les Demoiselles, I can't remember the name of it. The very famous.
D'Avignon.
Yeah, D'Avignon. Yes, the Mademoiselles of D'Avignon, and other paintings that he did about that time.
All right, so the image reminds you of works by Picasso, the more abstract or cubist art of the early 20th century, and the mask-like sense of the image. So given that that is what we're seeing here, would you think that this was based on a actual person, or would that this particular portrait was from the artist's imagination?
I would think, normally I would say it's not necessarily based on an actual person, but knowing the topic today, I assume it is based on an actual person.
Okay. Anyone else have thoughts on the kind of personality character of the individual, and perhaps once again, the relationship between the artist and the individual portrayed?
I was wondering, there's a small face over her, what would be her left shoulder. Can everybody see that? Over her left, I mean her left, so it'd be our right. There's like a little lower down, over, like right over the shoulder. Yeah, right there. And I was looking at that and I was thinking of it more like, almost like a Madonna with a child. Kind of, I don't know. I couldn't really tell if that was like somebody else in the background.
Is this
or
the
if
area
it's
you're talking about, Ruth?
lower down. Yeah, right in here. It almost looks like a sun. There's like an eye and looks like a nose and a mouth there. Almost like the
right
face is cut in half. Is that, does anybody else see that in there? Or is it me making a face out of lines? Does anybody see that?
I do.
Okay.
Okay.
I see
Sandy rose her hand.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about that. I think that's Ruth, that's a very thought-provoking observation. And let's think a little bit more about the choices the artist made in the background.
Right.
Perhaps, Paige, if we pan back out again a bit and take a look at what role the background is playing in this portrait. You know, where is this elongated head located? What is happening around it? And how does the background interact with the actual individual? Any thoughts on that? Anyway, the background makes you think of the location where they might be, or anything else?
Debbie?
It feels a little bit like almost a Mardi Gras. Very bright, very vibrant, a little wild and crazy.
Okay, a very active, energized environment that she's in.
But I tend to interpret things literally, so that may be my, you know.
Me too.
No, it's all good. There's definitely, Mardi Gras would be colorful, it would be energetic, active, and there certainly is the use of the lines in this image, the movement and the curves and the repeating of circles and the warm and very vibrant colors certainly do lend it a particularly striking and, for lack of a better word, that energy that you get from this image. What can you say anything about, I know we talked about the individual as looking like it's a mask as opposed to perhaps a real person. Is there anything else you might be able to tell about this individual, about their identity, about their personality from what you see here? Anything in the facial features that might, the hair, the clothing, anything that might?
It's definitely a female. And I would say a person who has a certain style to her based on the hair and also the detailing around the neck.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious to know how she felt about this portrait of her.
Well, I was going to ask that very question, is if this was a real person and they had their portrait painted or here, would you have been happy with a representation similar to this of you as a portrait?
Yeah. If I knew who the artist was and accepted, say if it were a Picasso and I knew that was his style, I'd say I might be, knowing that this is the way he or she would see me. It depends. There are other factors to me that are involved in that question.
Well, and unlike the photograph we just saw, this is not a, impromptu, spur of the moment sort of artistic creation, capturing, something that's very fleeting. This would have had to have been something that would have been worked on for some period of time. So, yes, that's.
Ruth,
yes,
did you have a comment? You have your hand raised. Was that intentional?
Yes. There's something about her eyes. They have a heavy lidded look, which makes you wonder if she's, you could think of it as like maybe sleepy or questioning, kind of like looking out under, like skeptical or something like that. There's something with her expression, the expression and the way her eyes appear under those heavy lids.
Yes.
I actually see the eyes as angry.
Yeah, very, very
well. The blue and red.
Okay, so angry or skeptical or questioning. So with that in mind, if this image was to speak, what would she say?
Get out of my way.
What are you doing?
I sort of pictured her as being a little sassy, like, hey doll, can you get me a drink from the bar kind of thing, something like that. So, but that was just me. I mean, what do others think about what she would say that might reflect the way that you see the image?
I get the impression of a little wild and crazy, if you will. Anything goes. I think the artist knew the person, but I don't think the person in the portrait posed necessarily, all of that time while it was painted. They knew the person, and that's the image and their interpretation of the person and partying and anything goes. So.
Okay, I think we've got a party theme going on here and a interesting assessment of who this individual was. So I'm going to move on at this point.
Sandy, oh,
Go ahead.
Ralinda,
Yes.
can we do one more comment from Sandy? She had her hand
Sure,
up.
absolutely, please.
Sandy, just remember to unmute your mic.
I thought she'd say, I'm a man dressed up as a woman in the Mardi Gras parade.
Oh, there you go. Could entirely be the case. I mean, look at what looks like a giant blue earring on the left ear and that hairdo and that, rather ornate clothing that appears down at the bottom of the image. I mean, who knows what's going on past the margins of this portrait? I mean, you sort of have to imagine it's being held in pretty tightly here. She's kind of been boxed in, but you can imagine her sort of busting loose with all sorts of stuff going on around her. So let's talk just quickly about the artist and this actual piece. So this is a painting on wood, to Elizabeth's point about perhaps some of it has some texture, from 2016. It is titled Nina, and it's by an African-American artist by the name of Levon Van Williams Jr. It is from the collection of Allen and Barry Huffman and currently is being shown in an exhibition at the Asheville Art Museum of Huffman Gifts of Contemporary Southern Folk Art, and we'll be there until September 30th if anybody's in the area and wants to go see it. The artist Williams was born in Lakeland, Florida in 1958, but moved with his mother to Colorado at the age of 10 when his parents divorced. He attended the University of Kentucky, and now here's going to be an interesting background for an artist, on a basketball scholarship and played on the men's basketball team that won the 1978 NCAA national championship. So kind of a basketball star. So after graduating with a degree in sociology, Williams played professionally abroad before returning to Kentucky in the 1980s to work as a teaching aide and youth basketball coach at a middle school in Lexington, Kentucky. Williams grew up in an artistic family. His mother made colorful abstract quilts, and his great uncle was a carver with mallet and chisel, which was a skill which sparked the artist's interest. But it was his older brother, Dave, who taught him the principles of relief woodworking, which is an art form originating in coastal South Carolina's African Gullah Geechee culture. If I'm mispronouncing that and anyone knows how to do it correctly, please correct me. So just as a quick sidebar, the Gullah Geechee are a group of African-American descendants of slaves from plantations that were located along the coasts of North and South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Because of their geographical isolation, the Gullah Geechee preserved more of their African cultural heritage than many other groups of African Americans, including the creation of African-styled handicrafts, such as baskets and wood carvings, originally that were created out of necessity as opposed to as an art form. When Williams began carving at the age of 15, he was the 5th generation in his family to do so. Inspired by his father's love of jazz and his mother's quilts, his wood relief sculptures tell stories of life in the African-American community, many inspired by blues music and jazz clubs, and focus on the human figure. He calls his sculptures urban folk art. And in his words, it is a sense of culture to pass on things that our ancestors had. It just gives me a connection to the past. And although much of Williams' art is carved wood sculptures and bas reliefs, this artwork, Nina, is not a carving, but paint on wood. So is it in fact a woman known to the artist? In my research, I didn't uncover any information that would lead me to one conclusion or another. The only clue I feel is the use of Nina as the title that seems to relate to a particular, potentially a particular person. Nevertheless, this portrait aptly reflects his approach to art, which in his words, if you're trying to express the soul or the inner part of the personality of a person more so than trying to capture the exact image like a photograph would do, you're looking for a fantastic movement or a fantastic shape that comes in the piece, and that's the whole power to the piece. You want a powerful presence. I think he managed to achieve that here. In this painting, Van Williams showcases his signature style, if you go and look at his other works, which are actually the bas relief and sculptures, with many of the artistic elements similar to those found in his other work, including an energetic composition, utilizing vibrant colors, bold and decisive lines, and an elongated, stylized human form. What the artist says best is, his quote is, "We are a work of art." So interesting. Yes. Someone have a comment? All right. So if not, we're going to move on to our third and final portrait. Thanks page. And let's again spend just a short time taking a look at this. Okay, what's going on in this artwork?
Well, this looks like a bear, and if you can zoom in, maybe there's an eye below the ear, like on the right there, somewhere in there. I think that's very interesting. It looks like an eye there. And also on the paws, there's little cuts in the wood, and I find that very interesting.
So you see some incised places on the wood sculpture, which indicate an eye and perhaps where the claws would be. What else can we see?
This one is kind of the sense of place and scale. In the artwork, I was sort of envisioning as a pretty small curving, something that fits in the palm of your hand. But I think the measurements listed on the website were like 9 by 11 by 4 3/4, which is pretty large. So I think that those sort of interesting tidbit that's, I'm sure is present when you're kind of looking at it physically, but maybe less so in just a two-dimensional image.
So having imagined without knowing initially the actual size of the piece, what made you imagine it to be fit in your palm?
I think because that's sort of what you'd think you'd like buy at like a trinket store or something like that, right? It's something that'd be like mass produced or something, and then you sort of say, no, it's bigger, it's got this elegance, it's got this real sculpture to it that makes it more than something you'd see 100 of. It's kind of a unique thing, but also just more substantial in size. So I think just those assumptions about some of those things.
What do you see, what makes you say elegance when you apply it to this bear?
I think the smoothness of the carving, it's, when I'm presuming this is wood, when you're carving, you can obviously make choices about the texture. The artist could have left this, with a rougher finish, but it looks like it's been really, polished. There's kind of even a shine at the top there, from the photo, but I think that just is kind of a sign of how beautifully polished the piece is.
And I also think that you see it through the lines of you see the grain of the wood.
Okay.
And the grain of the wood, I think is very defined and very elegant, just very, very subtle.
Okay, so the actual use of the material.
I lived in the last 16 years, and that was the first thought that came to mind. Why is something that looks almost Alaskan, at least to me, being at the museum? Now, I know we have also a lot of black bears down here, but there is something about it that reminds me of some artists whom I knew up in Juneau, who would have and could have and probably did do pieces like this.
Okay, well, when we talk about the artist and the piece, I think some of what will be revealed there may both, kind of support your thinking and also reveal, a little more about choice of subject matter given the artist and the context for the piece. Speaking again about the wood and the beauty of the wood and the grain, which was pointed out, and the detail with some of the incision into the wood, how would this particular piece change in your view if it had not been made of wood but of a different material?
There's a certain warmth to the wood if it were made of stone. I have seen, and I think I have had pieces like this in ivory, and talking about sort of the trinkets that you find in the stores when the cruise ships come to Juneau, pieces done in ivory, and there's a coldness to the ivory that the wood does have a certain warmth to it, and at least to me, a personalization.
Okay, so wood feels more personal and warmer. If it had been in what, ivory, I think you were saying, or some other material, that is a colder feeling to it. What can we say about, I think Ruth has her hand up, so let's do that first.
Oh, yeah. I was also looking at the posture of the bear. Okay, here I am, the veterinarian, but you know, it's an animal, and the artist could pick any posture that a bear would be found as. It's not a threatening posture. It's actually like an animal that's kind of like doing its normal day, smelling around, maybe foraging for something to eat. It's not threatening in any way. It's kind of peaceful.
That perfect segue. Actually, that was just the point that I was going to raise. So thank you, Ruth, for jumping in with that, because that is exactly what I was hoping we could talk about a bit. What is your impression of bears, or this particular bear, as you pointed out, giving it's what it seems to be doing in the moment, and the fact that it seems like a reasonably friendly animal here. So, you know, perhaps you would not be too concerned about running into this bear on a trail, or perhaps if you live in North Carolina like I do, in your backyard. But to take that a little further, given the options for how one could represent a bear, how do you think the artist feels about bears? At least from this
Sally
image.
Sally, you have your hand raised? Okay, you can unmute your microphone.
Well, to me, I think the artist must like bears. I mean, there's a warmth. I see the grain in the wood is almost the fur, and it makes me want to pat it, which is probably not a good idea. And the curves are soft. I mean, it doesn't have the fear factor that some sculpture of bear might, and it just following the lines, they're very they're just soft. Even in wood you can have more defined and almost angry kind of lines, but they're soft and smooth, and make you want to touch it, I think.
So that the artist, in his choice of this particular piece of wood, and in how he oriented the grain and use of the knot on the side of the broad side of the bear, and in how it's posed here, has made the bear a much more approachable, and obviously the artist has happy feelings about the bear. We don't see the claws extended. We don't see any teeth. Or anything threatening at all. So would you imagine that, given this posture, that the artist had seen a bear in this particular, in this kind of pose, so to speak? Or do you think that this is wholly out of his imagination?
I think the bear's in a natural habitat as opposed to a zoo or something. And I also see motion with the bear, as if it's moving forward and foraging, or, you know, smelling the ground in the area. And I think the artist has seen bears in their natural habitat in that formation.
So he seems to have, you're seeing the artist as having an experienced eye when it comes to bears, at least, and as represented in this piece seems to lend you that comfort that he's just not fabricating things out of his imagination. Although one does probably doubt that this was a bear that posed for this particular piece, needless to say. Would you, yes, please.
It does remind me of a number of photographs of photographers I know in Alaska who take a lot of bear pictures. And I also have an artist friend who paints, who also is from Alaska, and paints a lot of bears, and it would look like something that they might do based on photographs that they have, either that they've taken themselves or others have taken. I mean, I have photographs of bears that I have taken. But it is it's something sweet, at least to me, there's something sweet about it. It looks like the bear is in its own little world, sniffing around, almost like my dog does.
So in looking at this piece, as you're in the museum, you might come away with a very positive view of bears, that bears are not just scary and fierce, and that bears can be quite cuddly, although we're not petting them, as Sally was expressing a desire to do. But still, that they don't necessarily have to be considered always a threat. And so that perhaps this artwork has influenced our opinions about bears somewhat. So any other comments before we move on a little bit to talk about the artist and a little about this particular portrait? No? Yes, Ruth.
I have to say, when I first saw you picking artworks for this Slow Art Friday, and it was like portraits, after you had explained that it could be a reflection of the way the artist sees himself, I'm like, why did they choose a sculpture? And why is the sculpture an animal? And then when you were talking about it earlier, I started to think, well, maybe, the artist does see himself as, like almost like a spirit animal, which my children just love that concept.
Again, with you're kind of on to what's going to pop out now in just a minute about the artist and the bear. But yes, I mean, one can also raise the question of, well, is this a portrait? But which is why I prefaced this this conversation with a little around how portraits are defined and how narrow or broad one can imagine a portrait to be. If it's just a face, if it's just a human, if it can be in art forms other than painting, print, drawing, it can go into the three-dimensional form. And I think it's interesting to think about expanding our idea of what is or what is potentially not a portrait. So let's go ahead and plunge ahead here with the information about the artist and the piece. So this carved wood bear is by an American Cherokee artist, Virgil Ledford, and it is titled simply Bear. It was created around 2009. And Ledford was born in 1940 in Birdtown in the mountains of Western North Carolina. His grandfather was a woodcarver, and Ledford's interest in art began in elementary school, where he would draw outlines of animals on pieces of wood and then shape them with a mountain knife. Inspired by the animals that were seen in the woods around his home, so we were we get A+ on that assessment. By high school, Ledford was creating contemporary designs that related to his native land and the traditional culture of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. As the artist once said, "It's a God-given talent. I just made it work for me." We're speaking of wood carving here. "I would rather carve than eat." During high school, Ledford studied carving with Amanda Crow, an Eastern Band of Cherokee Indian wood carver and educator and graduate of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, who devoted much of her career to teaching and training Eastern Cherokee artists. In fact, wood carving was not considered an art form among the Cherokee until Amanda Crow elevated it to an art. Remarking on his artistic style, Ledford has said, "You can't carve like somebody else. You have got to have your own feeling of what the animal or bird looks like." To create a wood carving, Ledford first studies the animal, then he works out his design in pencil and traces the sketch onto a piece of wood, then roughs out the image with a chisel and mallet. The shape is refined with a bandsaw as well as a pocket knife for finer details. After sanding the carving, Ledford applies as many as 6 coats of finish, rubbing the polished wood between each coat and finishing the piece with wax. The artist uses a variety of native woods, including buckeye, cherry, and black walnut. I do not know the exact wood, unless perhaps Paige does, of this particular piece. but she cuts for himself or buys from a neighbor or from a local sawmill. He tries to carve each piece from an entire piece of wood and uses the grain to enhance the design, as we can see here. In a 1981 interview, Ledford explained his approach to wood carving as the more you do, the more imagination you get. I carve one piece and then change it to put in more feeling. As a member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, Ledford's heritage greatly influences his art. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians is found in Western North Carolina and is one of 3 tribes recognized by the federal government of the United States. Their name is derived from the Creek word meaning people of different speech. The Eastern Band of Cherokee traditionally have believed in a world of balance, harmony, and cooperation between people and nature. Historically, their wood carving served practical purposes, but they also created artistic carvings, distinguished by their smooth finish, which we see here, and the use of clear lacquer to bring out the colors and the textures of the wood. So he is really operating in the traditional style of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. So his bear follows this tradition both in its subject matter, in its materials, and its execution. And throughout his life, he's carved images of animals native to the North Carolina's forest, because in fact, bears are found in around 60% of the land in North Carolina, and to Ruth's point, are considered spiritual guides by the Eastern Band of Cherokee. So those are our 3 artworks for today. I have a few little closing comments and one last little surprise image for you to see in a moment. So I just want to thank you all for your thoughtful observations, your insights, your willingness to share, and your willingness to spend a July Friday noon with us. We've talked about how portraits can provide a glimpse into lives, both of the artist and the subject, whether the image is a good likeness or from the artist's imagination. From our conversation, perhaps we feel, I don't know, are people more comfortable viewing portraits than other artistic images? Did these portraits somehow feel familiar? When we view art, we're always assessing what we see. I like it, I don't like it. When we look at a portrait, are we even more confident to be, well, judgmental? He looks pompous, or what a sad face, or I love her outfit, but I would have never worn those gaudy earrings. Our relationship with the subject can feel almost personal, but it's okay to be flattering or catty because it's just a painting or a photograph or a sculpture. And certainly all art tells a story, though frankly, some are harder to figure out than others. But with portraits, the story of the subject often seems more readily available. So now before you go, I'd like to show you one more artwork from the museum's collection and leave you with a final question to noodle on after today. It's a photograph titled Interlocking Fingers Number 17 by John Copelands. Paige, could we see the final image, please? Okay, so my question for you, and then Paige has a few little parting words, is this a portrait? Thank you all. Paige, off to you.
So I guess that'll be a rhetorical or ending question for us to ponder this coming week. I want to thank you, Ralinda, for the selection of artworks that you shared with us today. And I want to thank you all who participated and created a wonderful conversation around these artworks. As a reminder, I hope you'll all join us again next week on July 23rd as our docent Hank Bovey will lead us in a conversation with the theme, Am I awake or am I dreaming? So I hope you'll tune in for that. In the meantime, have a wonderful weekend and we hope to see you again next week.
Thank you all.
Bye.